My daughter was less than an hour old when my parents walked into the hospital room and forgot how to breathe. Before they arrived, Elias had been holding her tiny fist between two fingers and telling me she already had my grip. I told him she had his timing, because she had waited until 3 in the morning to introduce herself. For a few minutes, the three of us laughed without being afraid of happiness. Then my mother saw Noelle. Her eyes moved from my baby's chocolate brown skin to the amber ring around her pupils. She leaned closer, saw the small crescent-shaped birthmark behind Noelle's shoulder, and gripped the rail of my bed. My father did not ask whether his granddaughter was healthy. He did not ask her name. He looked at the nurse and said, "Has her newborn screening card already been sent to the state lab?" The nurse stared at him. "I thought I had misheard." My mother whispered, "She looks like him." My father took her arm. They left without touching my child. Before the door closed, I heard him say, "We agreed the Rowan line ended with Clara." By sunrise, I had been removed from the family trust. The hospital had received an unauthorized request from an Armitage office asking where Noelle's newborn screening records and residual blood spot materials would be stored, and neither of my parents would answer my calls. The hospital denied the request because they were not her parents or guardians. For 20 years, I believed my parents had rejected my daughter because of how she looked. I was wrong. 20 years later, Noelle walked into federal bankruptcy court carrying a sealed evidence case and the calm expression she wore whenever she had found a mistake in someone else's numbers. Armitage Infrastructure Group was hours away from being broken apart. 4,000 employees could lose their jobs, and retirees could lose benefits. My parents sat behind a wall of attorneys, waiting for the granddaughter they had abandoned to prove that the company's largest debt was a fraud. Noelle did exactly that. She showed the judge how a supposed outside creditor had been created from inside Armitage's own computer system. She proved the signatures, account codes, and debt schedules had all been manufactured by the people asking the court to save them. My father closed his eyes in relief when the judge suspended the liquidation. He thought Noelle had rescued his empire. Then the judge asked why a 20-year-old student possessed records connected to a dead engineer named Silas Rowan. Noelle turned toward my parents. "You did not leave because of how I looked," she said. "You left because you recognized the family you had erased." The courtroom went silent. But that was not the sentence that made my mother collapse. Her last words explained who I was, why my parents had raised me, and why saving their company would cost them everything they had protected for 40 years. Stay with me to learn what my parents recognized in my newborn daughter, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the truth that brought their empire to its knees. 20 years earlier, labor began just after midnight, with Elias standing in our kitchen, holding the hospital bag in one hand and the television remote in the other. I stared at the remote. "Are you planning to change channels during delivery?" He looked down, dropped it on the counter, and grabbed my coat. "I am handling this calmly." During the drive, he checked whether I was breathing, whether the baby was moving, and whether he had locked the front door. I reminded him that I was the one having contractions. He apologized, then asked whether apologizing was helping. By 3 in the morning, the fear had narrowed into effort, voices, and Elias's hand locked around mine. When Noelle finally cried, the sound seemed to open the room. The doctor said she was healthy, with 10 fingers, 10 toes, strong lungs, and a steady heartbeat. Elias bent over her as if he had been handed every good thing he had ever asked for. Noelle closed her tiny hand around his finger. "She has your grip," he said. "I should prepare to lose every argument in this house." "She has your timing," I told him. 3 in the morning, and she already expects an audience. He laughed, kissed my forehead, and asked the nurse to repeat that she was healthy. The nurse did, more gently this time, and I watched the tension leave his shoulders. My parents arrived shortly after dawn. Conrad entered first in a dark suit that looked untouched by the early hour. Vivian followed with a silver gift box tied in white ribbon. They always moved as though someone might be watching. For one hopeful second, I believed Noelle might change them. Vivian came to the bedside and looked into the bassinet. Her smile vanished. Her gaze moved over Noelle's face, paused at the amber ring around her pupils, then dropped to the chocolate-brown skin visible above the blanket. The nurse lifted Noelle carefully so Vivian could see her better. The blanket slipped just enough to reveal the small, crescent-shaped birthmark behind her shoulder. Vivian gripped the bed rail. Conrad stepped closer. He did not congratulate us. He did not ask her name or whether I was all right. "Has her newborn screening card already been sent to the state lab?" he asked. The nurse's expression tightened. "The screening card is used to test for certain medical conditions. It is not a paternity test." "I know what it is," Conrad said. "I asked whether it has been sent." "No," she replied. "And any information about the baby's records can only be discussed with her parents or legal guardians." Vivian kept staring at Noelle. "She looks like him." I felt Elias straighten beside me. "Like whom?" I asked. Conrad seized Vivian's arm before she could answer. His face had changed from shock to calculation, the expression he wore when a board meeting stopped going his way. "We should leave," he said. Vivian placed the silver box on the chair without opening it. She looked at me once, but there was no joy in her face, only fear, and something that felt worse because I could not name it. They walked out without touching their granddaughter. Through the partly open door, I saw Conrad take out his phone. "Call Mercer," he said. "Do it immediately." Mercer was the family attorney. Elias moved toward the hallway, but I caught his wrist. "Let me go after them. I need you here with us. Clara, he is calling a lawyer because our daughter was born." "I know." My voice shook, but I tightened my hold. "I will not let Noelle's first hour become a fight in a hospital corridor." Elias looked at the bassinet, then back at me. He returned to my side and closed the door. The consequences arrived before breakfast. An email from Mercer informed me that I had been removed from the Armitage Family Trust and stripped of every representative role in the Armitage Foundation. The message described the decision as an immediate response to irreconcilable differences concerning family obligations. I read it twice, while Noelle slept against my chest. A hospital records employee came to our room soon afterward. She explained that an Armitage office had submitted an unauthorized request asking where Noelle's screening card and any residual blood spot material would be stored. The request also asked for copies of documents connected to the sample collection. "We denied everything," she said. "Your parents have no legal authority over your daughter. The request and denial will remain in the access log." I thanked her, although I barely understood why anyone wanted that information. The screening did not establish family relationships. Conrad knew that, so his interest was not medical. I called Vivian. She answered after the fourth attempt. "Finally," she said. "You chose your family." I looked at Elias asleep in the chair with one hand resting near Noelle's bassinet. "I am looking at my family," I said. "You are the one choosing to leave it." I ended the call before she could answer. That afternoon, Elias and I decided that Armitage would remain on my legal records until the paperwork could be changed, but in daily life we would use Vale, Elias's mother's family name. We would not raise Noelle beneath a name that treated her birth as a threat. Before discharge, I remembered the silver gift box. The white ribbon came loose beneath my fingers. There were no baby clothes inside, no blanket, and no card welcoming Noelle into the family. There was only an old photograph and a torn greeting card whose sender's name had been carefully removed. In the photograph stood a young man I had never seen before. He had Noelle's amber eyes. The photograph in the silver box remained inside my nightstand for years, wrapped in the same tissue paper Vivian had used to hide it. I told myself I kept it because one day I might understand why a stranger's eyes had frightened my parents more than the birth of their granddaughter had moved them. The truth was less dignified. I kept it because throwing it away felt like letting them erase one more thing. Elias never pressed me to look at it. He helped me file the paperwork to become Clara Vale, stood beside me when the Armitage Foundation removed my biography from its website, and treated our small rented house as if it were the beginning of a dynasty. We did not have marble floors, trust distributions, or Christmas photographs arranged by a publicist. We had second-hand furniture, a leaking kitchen faucet, and a baby who refused to sleep unless Elias walked slow circles through the living room. Noel's first birthday was held in our backyard beneath paper lanterns that collapsed when the sprinklers came on. Our friends carried the cake inside while Elias tried to rescue the decorations with a broom. Noel laughed so hard at him that she pressed both hands into the frosting. I remember looking around our crowded kitchen and realizing that every person there had come because they loved her, not because a family calendar told them to appear. On her first day of school, Noelle wore a yellow backpack nearly as large as her body. I worried she would look back and see me crying, so I waited until she reached the classroom door. She turned anyway, ran back, and whispered that I did not have to be brave until she was inside. Then she kissed my cheek and marched away, as if she had reassigned the roles between us. Our home filled slowly with people who stayed. Friends brought soup when we were sick, sat through school concerts, and learned that Noelle hated raisins but would eat almost anything covered in cinnamon. When I taught her to bake at 9, she measured flour with the solemn concentration of a chemist. The cake collapsed in the middle, and she filled the crater with strawberries, because, as she explained, evidence of failure should always be edible. At 8, she was assigned a family tree project. She drew Elias and me, then added neighbors, teachers, 2 family friends, and the dog from next door. I asked why the dog had earned a branch. "Because he always comes when I call," she said. "That has to count for something." It did count, more than I admitted aloud. Elias declared Sunday mornings sacred and made pancakes regardless of whether anyone wanted them. His pancakes were thick enough to resist a fork, and by 12, Noelle had begun calling them construction samples. "At least, they would survive an earthquake," he told her. "That is not usually a breakfast requirement," she replied. Those mornings became the shape of our life. Elias defending impossible pancakes, Noelle correcting him, and me pretending not to notice that both of them always gave me the least damaged one. From the outside, I had moved on. I worked, raised my daughter, and learned to answer questions about my parents without revealing anything that could reopen the wound. Yet some nights, after Elias and Noelle were asleep, I searched the Armitage name online. I watched Conrad open bridges, Vivian host foundation dinners, and executives applaud speeches about responsibility and legacy. Noelle never appeared in their photographs. Neither did I. Each time I closed the browser, I promised it would be the last time. The promise rarely lasted more than a few months. Noelle grew into someone who disliked unanswered numbers more than unanswered people. She studied forensic accounting and digital data recovery, not because she possessed some miraculous gift, but because patterns calmed her. During her internship, she learned how old databases were migrated, how metadata survived careless deletion, and how financial records could contradict the story printed above them. By 20, she could spend 3 hours reconstructing a damaged ledger and then forget where she had left her shoes. Elias said this proved genius, and common sense were administered by separate departments. The first public sign that Armitage was collapsing appeared on a Tuesday morning. I was drinking coffee when a local news report announced that Armitage Infrastructure Group had filed for Chapter 11 protection. The anchor explained that a company called Raven Rock Holdings claimed to hold a secured debt large enough to take control of Armitage's most valuable projects, equipment, and real estate. Analysts warned that thousands of employees could lose their jobs. Retirees were already asking whether their benefits would survive. I turned off the television. Noelle turned it back on. "We are not getting involved," I said. "I did not say we were. You are making the face you make before you reorganize someone else's evidence." She sat beside me and listened as a former Armitage employee described 32 years with the company and the pension his wife depended on. Noelle's attention never moved to Conrad or Vivian. "If Raven Rock takes the profitable assets," she said, "what remains pays the workers and retirees?" The reporter answered before I could. "Very little." I do not care what happens to their empire, I said. Neither do I, Noelle replied. I care who they plan to leave underneath it. The call from attorney Nadine Holt came that afternoon. She represented an old estate connected to a deceased engineer named Silas Rowan. While reviewing the estate catalog, she had found a reference to me beside an Armitage archive code. The entry did not explain the connection, and the bankruptcy filing did not automatically give her permission to open restricted company files. Nadine was preparing a request for limited court-authorized inspection because the same archive code appeared beside early references to Raven Rock. She wanted to know whether I had ever met Silas Rowan. I have never heard that name outside the sentence my father spoke at the hospital, I said. Nadine paused. Your father mentioned Rowan when Noelle was born? I regretted answering, but it was too late. I told her only that Conrad had said the Rowan line was supposed to end with me. Nadine asked whether I possessed any old correspondence, photographs, or property connected to the Armitages. I retrieved the silver box. Noelle laid the torn card and the photograph beneath a desk lamp. The card had been cut so carefully that only the edge of the sender's signature remained. On the back of the photograph, she found old adhesive and a narrow strip of different paper. This was attached to something larger, she said. Someone cut him out of another photograph. 2 days later, a padded envelope arrived from Miriam Cole, a retired Armitage records manager whose name Nadine had found in the estate catalog. Inside was a group photograph, taken during the company's earliest years. Conrad and Vivian stood among 6 young employees in front of Armitage's first field office. At the far left stood the man from my silver box. The photograph on the company website showed the same group, but he had been removed and the remaining people shifted closer together. His eyes held the same amber ring as Noelle's. A crescent-shaped mark was visible above the collar of his work shirt. Beneath the photograph, Miriam had written an old archive box code and one sentence. Silas Rowan did not steal from Armitage. Armitage stole him. 3 days after Miriam Cole's envelope arrived, Elias drove us to a narrow brick house outside the city. The original photograph lay in Noelle's lap, inside a clear protective sleeve, while the cropped version from the silver box remained sealed in another. I had spent the entire drive comparing the same amber eyes and telling myself resemblance was not proof. Miriam opened the door before we reached the porch. She was in her late 70s, with silver hair pinned at the nape of her neck and the alert expression of someone who had spent a career noticing when records did not match the story attached to them. You have Marian's mouth, she said to me. The name stopped me, but Miriam immediately stepped aside. I am sorry. There are things I remember and things I can prove. I should not confuse the two. Her dining table was covered with carefully labeled folders. Before any of us sat down, she explained that she had never taken confidential ledgers, contracts, or company data from Armitage. What she possessed was limited to personal letters. Silas had mailed directly to her, a group photograph he had given her, several old index cards with archive locations, and a copy of the 2003 digitization handover report employees had been permitted to retain for their professional records. I was a records manager, not a burglar, she said. If the truth exists in the company archive, these codes may tell the court where to look. They are not the truth by themselves. She placed a faded cardboard box on the table. The handwritten label read, Family Correspondence, Unimportant. Noelle studied it. In the Armitage world, I assume unimportant means never let a judge see this. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. The sound felt inappropriate and necessary at the same time. Miriam smiled, then opened the box. There were no secret account books inside. We found birthday cards, private letters, old photographs, and index cards marked with building numbers, shelf rows, and archive box codes. The papers did not solve anything, but they formed a map leading toward records someone had spent decades making difficult to find. One photograph showed Silas standing beside the first steel frame Armitage had erected under its own name. Another showed him leaning over a structural drawing with Conrad. The typed caption beneath it called them co-founders. A letter Silas had written to Miriam described a bridge design dispute and ended with a joke about Conrad caring more about the dedication plaque than the load calculations. The words made him feel less like a symbol and more like a man who had once been tired, amused, and certain he belonged inside the company. Miriam showed us an early company directory listing Silas Rowan as structural engineer and founding partner. Then she placed the 2003 digitization handover report beside it. During the migration from paper archives and an aging mainframe into a newer database, Silas's title had been changed to Terminated Consultant. His original box codes had also been moved into a restricted storage category without an explanation. Could that have been a clerical error? Elias asked. One change might be an error, Miriam replied. A title, an employment status, and every related archive code changing together is a decision. She said Silas had become worried in 1984 after seeing preliminary documents for a related corporate entity. He believed Conrad and Vivian were testing a structure that could move valuable assets out of Armitage if the company ever entered a crisis, leaving obligations behind in the original business. Miriam did not know whether the structure had ever been completed. She only remembered Silas telling her that a company should not be allowed to create its own lifeboat and then drill holes beneath everyone else. In 2003, while reviewing the migration records, she saw several of the old entity codes entered into the new system. Under one name, Raven Rock, Noel sat forward. The same Raven Rock claiming the secured debt now? The name is the same, Miriam said. That is all I can swear to. That restraint made me trust her more than certainty would have. Miriam was not presenting herself as the keeper of a complete conspiracy. She had fragments, dates, and a path toward records that still required independent verification. Noel then told her about the consumer genealogy test she had taken after turning 18. A close connection to a Rowan family tree had appeared briefly in her account, then disappeared when the other user made the profile private. I assumed the person changed their mind, Noel said. The testing company did not alter my results, and no one bought the database. The match simply stopped being available for contact. That might have remained a coincidence if Nadine had not found Armitage invoices issued during the same period. Vivian's office had paid a private genealogical investigator and a data broker to monitor public references to the Rowan name. The investigator later contacted the relative linked to Noel's account, warning that an unknown young woman might be attempting identity theft. The relative had responded by making the family tree private. My parents had not controlled Noel's DNA or changed a test. They had done something more ordinary and, in its way, more chilling. They had watched public records, school listings, and research references for signs that she was moving toward Rowan, then quietly frightened away the people who might have answered her questions. They had never forgotten my daughter. They had followed the moment she might discover them. Vivian called me that evening and asked to meet alone. She chose a private room in a hotel restaurant where the staff addressed her by name and closed the door behind me. She looked older than she had on television, though no less composed. On the table beside her was a photograph of Noel at approximately 6 years old, standing outside her elementary school in a red coat. I had never sent it to her. Where did you get that? Vivian covered the photograph with one hand. We kept informed. That is not the same as interfering. You hired people to watch when my daughter searched for a family named Rowan. We were protecting her from a painful history. You were protecting yourself from a conversation. Vivian slid a folder across the table. It contained an offer to pay the remainder of Noel's education, clear any student debt, and provide a substantial private settlement. In return, Noel and I would withdraw our support for Nadine's request to inspect the Silas Rowan archive and agree not to pursue additional records. I pushed the folder back. Vivian did not touch it. If this bankruptcy becomes a public battle over 40-year-old accusations, thousands of employees could lose their jobs before the truth is sorted out. For one moment, The argument reached the part of me that feared becoming responsible for innocent people's pain. I thought of the retired employee on the news, and the families whose paychecks depended on Armitage surviving. Vivian saw the hesitation and leaned closer. Silence is not always cowardice, Clara. Sometimes it is mercy. Mercy for whom? She had no answer. That did not expose her. When I returned home, Noelle was reading the invoices Nadine had obtained. She pointed to the investigator's billing descriptions, which listed not only the Rowan monitoring, but also her university, forensic accounting internship, and research project on legacy data migration. At our next meeting, Vivian repeated that she wanted to spare Noelle unnecessary damage. Noelle placed the invoice on the table between them. "You know the name of my internship supervisor," she said. "You know my school schedule and the subject of a research paper I never published. How long have you been following me?" Vivian looked at me rather than my daughter. Her refusal was the answer. 2 days later, Nadine received permission to inspect a limited portion of the sealed estate file because Miriam's archive codes overlapped with early Raven Rock references. The first document released was not a corporate ledger or a debt schedule. It was my original birth certificate. My eyes went first to the space marked mother. The name written there was not Vivian Armitage. It was Marian Armitage Rowan. I read the name on my birth certificate until the letters stopped looking like language. Marian Armitage Rowan. Vivian had never been listed as my mother. Conrad had never been listed as my father. Beneath Marian's name was another entry that made the room feel smaller. Silas Rowan. Nadine waited until I looked up before explaining the timeline. I had been born in 1983. Marian was Vivian's younger sister and Silas Rowan's lawful wife. She died from complications only days after giving birth to me, leaving Silas as my surviving parent and legal guardian. The facts were simple when Nadine said them. That made them harder to absorb. Silas had not been a distant relative whose photograph accidentally ended up in a silver gift box. He had been my father. Vivian had not taken in an abandoned child from outside the family. She had raised her dead sister's daughter while making sure I never knew the woman's name. "What happened to him?" I asked. Nadine opened a chronology compiled from court indexes, employment records, and the limited portion of the estate file she had been authorized to review. In 1984, Silas objected to an internal proposal called Project Raven Rock. Soon afterward, Conrad accused him of stealing bidding data and preparing to leave the company with confidential material. While the police and Armitage conducted separate investigations, Silas lost his job and access to company property. Vivian petitioned for temporary guardianship of me, arguing that an infant needed a stable home, while Silas faced possible criminal charges and unemployment. The court granted limited temporary custody. Silas challenged it. He died in a construction site accident in 1985, before the custody dispute was resolved. Conrad and Vivian completed a legal adoption afterward and began presenting me publicly as their biological daughter. Nadine closed the folder. The adoption itself was lawful. Nothing in the records suggests the court knew the accusations against Silas might have been manufactured. The problem is what happened before the adoption and what they concealed afterward. I understood the distinction, but it did not soften anything. They had not committed a crime by raising me. They had betrayed me by building my childhood on a lie and removing every path that might have led back to the people I came from. Memories began returning with different meanings. Vivian had never allowed me into the basement records room at the Armitage headquarters, even when other executives brought their children to work. When I asked why no one had photographs of her pregnancy, she said wealthy families valued privacy. When I found an old sympathy card addressed to Vivian after Marian's death, she told me Marian had been a distant cousin and threw the card away. Once, after a teacher said I did not resemble either parent, Vivian had stared at me for a long moment and replied, "Clara has never looked like anyone in this family." I had believed she meant I was unique. Now, I wondered whether it had been a warning spoken too quietly for me to understand. Noelle stood near the window, reading the chronology for herself. She did not cry. Her anger made her precise. "We need the rest of the archive," she said. "No." She turned. "Mom, the code Miriam gave us may lead to the record Silas was trying to protect." I said no. The force in my voice startled all three of us. Noelle set the pages down. "They watched me for years. They contacted a Rowan relative to stop us from speaking. They offered money to keep this sealed. We cannot stop when we finally know where to look. They are already using you." I heard the fear beneath my anger but could not separate them. "The bankruptcy attorneys want your recovery skills. Nadine needs standing to open records. My parents want to scare us into silence. Everyone sees you as the person who can unlock something. I chose to help. You are 20 years old. I am old enough to understand what they did. You are not old enough to know what it feels like when the family who raised you turns out to have designed your entire identity." The words hurt her, and I knew it before she answered. "Mom, they are still deciding what I am allowed to know, and you are helping them." I stepped back as if she had struck me. Noelle's expression changed immediately, but she did not withdraw the sentence. That made it worse, because some part of me recognized the truth inside it. I was trying to protect her by closing the same door Vivian had kept closed for me. Elias moved between us, without taking either side. "This family is allowed to disagree," he said. "What makes us different from the Armitages is that disagreement does not become punishment, and silence does not become a weapon." Noelle looked away. I sat at the table because my legs no longer felt reliable. I told her everything I remembered about the night she was born. I described Conrad's first question about the screening card, Vivian's whisper that Noelle looked like someone, and the sentence I had heard outside the hospital door. We agreed. The Rowan line ended with Clara. I told her about the request for information on the residual blood spot material and the hospital's refusal. I admitted that for 20 years I had believed their fear began with the color of her skin. Noelle touched the crescent-shaped mark behind her shoulder. "They saw more than that," she said. "They saw his eyes. They saw this mark. They recognized Rowan before you even knew Rowan was a name." The idea settled over me, with a grief that reached farther back than the hospital room. My parents had not been surprised by who Noelle's father was. Elias had always been her father, and no one questioned that. Conrad and Vivian had panicked because my daughter carried visible traces of the man they had removed from my life. Nadine submitted Miriam's archive codes to the bankruptcy examiner. Because the codes overlapped with early Raven Rock references, the examiner obtained authorization to inspect the restricted storage area at Armitage headquarters. Miriam did not hand us secret corporate records from her home. Her index cards only told the examiner where the real archive had once been assigned. The search took place inside an Armitage storage facility, under supervision. Company counsel attended. Nadine attended. An independent digital forensics expert documented every seal, label, and transfer. Inside the designated section, they found a paper index, an old mainframe data tape, and a handwritten note preserved in a protective sleeve. The note was signed with Silas Rowan's initials. "If Armitage ever enters bankruptcy, open the bridge file first." Noelle read the sentence over a secure video call with the examiner. For the first time since the birth certificate appeared, hope moved across her face. "I can help identify the data structure," she said. I felt fear rise again, but before I could object, she continued. "Only with an independent expert. I will not recover it alone, copy anything privately, or publish a conclusion that has not been verified." She looked at me when she said it. She was not asking permission to know the truth. She was promising not to let the truth turn her into someone else's weapon. I nodded. The recovery took several days. The tape was old, and portions of the index had degraded. The expert warned us that damaged data could not be treated as complete evidence, and that every readable file would need to be compared against paper records and later system logs. We watched from a conference room while the first directory structure appeared on the screen. I expected a folder defending Silas against the theft allegation, or a personal archive explaining what had happened to him. The first readable directory carried a different name: Raven Rock, Prototype. The folder name appeared on the recovery screen in pale green letters: Raven Rock, Prototype. The independent forensic specialist, Dr. Aaron Bell, warned us not to treat the discovery as a confession preserved on magnetic tape. The data had survived more than 40 years, but some sectors were damaged, several dates required verification, and the directory contained working documents rather than a finished transaction. "What we have is a map," he said. "It may show where people intended to go. It does not prove they completed the journey." The readable files included mainframe project codes, proposed asset transfer schedules, internal audit notes, and messages Silas had preserved through the company's authorized backup process before his access was revoked. Nothing had been hidden in a personal safe or stolen from Armitage. The records had remained inside the corporate archive all along, buried beneath a restricted classification and a false description of the man who created the backup. The 1984 prototype described a related entity that would remain dormant until Armitage faced a severe financial crisis. At that point, the company's most valuable contracts, land, equipment, and active projects could be transferred to the related entity. The original company would retain pension obligations, unpaid vendors, litigation exposure, and most of the debt. Silas had written objections into the audit notes. One line appeared repeatedly beside different transfer schedules: "No independent business purpose." Another asked why a supposed emergency structure was being designed before any emergency existed. The prototype had not been fully implemented in 1984. Several approval fields remained blank, and Silas's objections had forced the internal review to continue. Raven Rock had existed then as codes, diagrams, and proposed legal structures rather than a functioning outside creditor. That distinction mattered. My parents had not spent 40 years operating the exact same fraud without interruption. They had created an early design, abandoned it when scrutiny became dangerous, then returned to it later. The 2003 digitization records revealed how, during the migration from the old mainframe and paper system, the original Raven Rock codes were mapped into the new accounting platform. A related entity with the same name was formally registered. Old references to Silas as a founding partner were removed, while his objections were moved into a restricted category that ordinary employees could not search. The company had used modernization to make an old plan look newly born. Noel sat beside Dr. Bell, comparing 3 layers of identifiers. The first came from the 1984 mainframe. The second came from the mapping tables used during the 2003 conversion. The third appeared in Raven Rock Holdings' current loan documents. She did not announce a conclusion. She marked matching fields and asked Dr. Bell to verify each one independently. The same 3-part checksum formula appeared in all 3 systems. More strangely, one project code contained an old transposition error. 2 numbers had been reversed in 1984, copied into the 2003 mapping table, and repeated again in the current Raven Rock debt schedules. "It is like copying a spelling mistake through 3 editions of a book," Noel said. "Different covers, same original page." Dr. Bell agreed that the repetition strongly suggested a common internal source. Nadine immediately reminded us that similarity was not enough to prove legal control. "We still need to know who created the modern accounts, who approved the debt, and where the money moved," she said. "A shared code can connect systems. It cannot by itself establish intent." That caution frustrated me until I looked at the list of employees attached to the bankruptcy filing. Welders, engineers, office staff, equipment operators, and retired workers had built their lives around Armitage. If we made a public accusation before the evidence was ready, lenders could withdraw, projects could stop, and the people least responsible might suffer first. Vivian had already used those people as a shield when she asked me to remain silent. I refused to use them as collateral for my anger. Noel struggled with the same realization, Only days earlier, she had believed that exposing every record immediately was the most honest choice. Now she understood that truth released without discipline could damage the very people she wanted to protect. "I thought justice meant opening every door," she told me after one long meeting. "Now it feels like we have to decide which room might collapse when we do." "We do not have to protect Conrad or Vivian," I said. "But we cannot punish 4,000 people just to reach them faster." Elias entered the dining room, carrying 3 plates. Each held a pancake burned around the edges and pale in the center. He placed them beside the 3 stacks of financial records covering our table. "I have prepared a controlled experiment," he said. "Which is harder to digest, the pancakes or the bankruptcy documents?" Noel examined both choices. "The documents. At least the pancakes are not lying about what they are." Elias looked almost proud. "That may be the kindest review my cooking has received." The moment did not remove the fear, but it reminded me that we were still a family rather than an investigation team. We could step away from the documents long enough to laugh, then return without losing our purpose. The next verified files concerned the accusation that had destroyed Silas. Shortly after, he objected to Raven Rock in 1984. Bidding documents were copied into a directory registered under his employee account. Conrad had cited those files as proof that Silas intended to steal confidential information and take it to a competitor. The access logs told a different story. The files had been created while Silas was supervising work at a remote construction site. Daily site reports, fuel receipts, and signed safety logs placed him there for the entire shift. The location had no connection to the Armitage mainframe. Someone had used his credentials, while he was physically unable to access the system. The 2003 migration team had encountered the timing conflict. A warning flag appeared in the conversion notes, identifying an impossible overlap between Silas's field assignment and the mainframe activity. Whoever approved the migration had ordered the files imported without resolving the discrepancy. Silas had not been cleared by those records alone. Someone could argue that he had shared his password or arranged for another person to act on his behalf. But the evidence weakened the story my parents had used to remove him from the company and from me. While Dr. Bell traced the modern Raven Rock accounts, Noel found that the supposed creditors' loan schedules had been generated from an internal Armitage contract template. Metadata connected several approval documents to a secure encryption vault used for executive signatures. Everyone expected that vault to belong to Conrad's office. It did not. The access permissions were assigned to the office of the chair of the Armitage Foundation and controlled by Vivian's executive staff. I remembered every time Vivian had dismissed financial conversations by saying she left numbers to Conrad. At dinners, she had called balance sheets tedious. During my childhood, she presented herself as the compassionate half of their marriage, the woman who cared about hospitals, scholarships, and public service, while Conrad handled business. The records did not yet prove that she created Raven Rock or directed the entire scheme. They proved only that her office possessed the encryption controls used to generate the modern debt documents. It was enough to change the shape of my memories. Vivian had always encouraged people to underestimate her. Perhaps helplessness had never been her weakness. Perhaps it had been one of her tools. Late that evening, Dr. Bell recovered a set of internal messages from 1984. Most were technical discussions about transfer schedules, audit objections, and legal review. One message had been sent from Conrad's account directly to Vivian. Nadine asked the specialist to verify the header and timestamp before reading it aloud. The message contained a single sentence. "I will use your structure, but if Silas clears the audit, we lose Clara and the company." The email from Conrad changed the question I had been asking since the hospital. Until then, I had wondered how much Vivian knew. Conrad's words suggested something worse. Raven Rock had been her structure before it became his weapon. Vivian came to our house the next morning without a driver, an attorney, or Conrad. She stood on the porch in a plain gray coat, holding nothing but her handbag. I almost refused to let her inside, but she said Marian's name before I could close the door. "Please, Clara, I owe you the truth about your mother." Elias remained in the kitchen while Noelle went upstairs with the files. Neither of them trusted Vivian, but they understood that part of me still needed to hear what she would say when she had no audience to impress. Vivian sat on the edge of our sofa and folded her hands. She said Conrad had forced her to remain silent after Silas was accused of stealing company data. According to her, Conrad had threatened to destroy the Armitage Foundation and make sure I entered foster care if she challenged him. "I brought you home because I promised Marian I would protect you," she said. "I loved my sister, and I loved you before you were old enough to remember me." Her voice broke at precisely the right moment. I recognized the timing and still felt something inside me respond. Vivian remembered the blue blanket I dragged through the house until I was 5. She remembered that I refused to sleep unless the closet door was open exactly 3 inches. She described the winter I developed pneumonia and how she sat beside my bed counting each breath. Those details were real. They belonged to the woman who had raised me, regardless of what name appeared on my birth certificate. "You were afraid of thunderstorms," she said. "You would climb into my bed and press your feet against my legs because they were always cold." I had not told Elias that memory. I had not told Noelle. For several dangerous minutes, I wanted Vivian's explanation to be true. I wanted Conrad to be the single architect of everything, because then I could preserve some version of the mother I had loved. Vivian reached into her handbag and placed a small encrypted drive on the coffee table. "This contains records Conrad believes were destroyed," she said. "It shows how he controlled Raven Rock, authorized the false debt, and planned to move the profitable assets after bankruptcy. Why give it to me? Because Noelle can help stop the liquidation. Use what is necessary to save the company. Once the employees and retirees are safe, let the family resolve the rest privately." The request sounded reasonable until I examined what she was asking me to separate. She wanted us to expose enough fraud to rescue Armitage without exposing the people who had created it. "You mean let you resolve it privately," I said. "I mean avoid destroying what can still be preserved." Vivian insisted that Conrad had become reckless. She said she had remained near him because someone needed to protect the foundation, the employees, and me. Each explanation made her sound like a prisoner who happened to control the prison's charitable wing. I did not accuse her. I gave the drive to Nadine, who transferred it to Dr. Bell under documented conditions. Noelle observed the examination but did not work on the original files alone. Within hours, the metadata contradicted Vivian's story. Several documents had been modified after Armitage filed for bankruptcy. Sections describing Conrad's approvals remained intact, but references to Vivian's executive office had been deleted. Access logs showed that the changes came from credentials assigned to a system administrator who reported to the foundation's legal department. The drive contained genuine records, but someone had curated them to make Conrad appear solely responsible. "She did not give us evidence," Noelle said. "She gave us an edited prosecution." Dr. Bell recovered fragments from the deleted sections, though he warned that the complete text would take longer to reconstruct. Nadine then contacted Miriam about the 2003 digitization report. Miriam confirmed that Vivian had personally requested the change in Silas's classification from founding partner to terminated consultant. Her copy of the handover report did not contain the hidden company records themselves. It proved only that Vivian had issued the relabeling instruction and that the original archive codes had been transferred to restricted storage. Vivian had not merely remained silent while Conrad erased Silas. She had signed the administrative order that made the erasure searchable as truth. Miriam also brought Nadine a personal letter Marian had mailed to her shortly before I was born. Unlike the corporate archive, the letter had always belonged to Miriam because Marian had addressed it directly to her. Marian wrote that she and Silas intended to announce their marriage publicly after I was born. She knew her health was fragile and stated clearly that, if she died, Silas was to continue raising me. There was no request for Vivian to take me. There was no promise making her my mother. Nothing in the letter suggested Vivian had harmed Marian, and nothing we had found proved Silas's construction accident had been anything other than an accident. The betrayal already supported by evidence was enough. We did not need to invent murder to make it monstrous. I asked Vivian to meet me again, in Nadine's office. This time, Noel and Elias sat beside me while the drive, the metadata report, Miriam's handover document, and Marian's letter rested on the table. Vivian read Marian's letter without asking how we had obtained it. "You knew she wanted Silas to raise me," I said. "Marian was dying. She did not understand what Silas had become. He had challenged your financial structure. He was prepared to tear apart the company while you needed stability." The sentence slipped out before she could soften it. I asked why keeping me mattered to Armitage. Vivian looked toward Noel, then back at me. "If you had remained with the Rowan family, Silas would have had every reason to continue fighting. He would have had a daughter to protect, standing in the company, and a public story people could sympathize with. So you took away the daughter. I gave that daughter a home. You used me to weaken him. I raised you when Conrad did not want the responsibility. I gave you schools, security, travel, and every advantage Marian could never have provided." Her defense rested entirely on the price of the life she had purchased for me. "Does love require erasing a child's real parents?" I asked. "Does it require changing her father from a founder into a criminal and teaching her that her mother never existed?" Vivian's face hardened. "Conrad did not want you in our house. I was the one who brought you home." She expected gratitude. That was the part that finally broke the remaining illusion. Vivian did not view controlling my identity as the cost of raising me. She viewed raising me as the generosity that entitled her to control my identity. Even then, she did not confess to designing Raven Rock. She continued insisting that Conrad had corrupted an old contingency plan and that the edited drive was necessary because the company could not survive both of them being removed. She still believed she could use me to defeat him while preserving her own position. That evening, Dr. Bell recovered the first deleted document from Vivian's drive. It was a memorandum written under her name decades earlier. Noel read the opening sentence aloud. "The cleanest bankruptcy is the one the public believes was unavoidable." Vivian's memorandum ended any illusion that she had merely stood beside Conrad while he designed Raven Rock. Still, Nadine warned us that proving she had written a disturbing sentence was not the same as proving every transaction that followed. The hearing was approaching, and Armitage's attorneys suddenly became eager to cooperate. They proposed that Noel testify only about the technical evidence showing Raven Rock was not a genuine outside creditor. She could explain the matching project codes, the repeated transposition error, and the modern contracts created inside Armitage's own system. In exchange, they wanted her to avoid discussing Silas, the altered 2003 archive records, or Vivian's encryption vault. Their argument was polished. The court needed a narrow answer quickly enough to stop the asset sale. Family history, they said, could be addressed later through private litigation. Nadine listened without agreeing. "They are not asking us to lie," she told us afterward. "They are asking us to tell only the portion of the truth that saves the company without threatening the people who control it." That distinction was what made the offer dangerous. Conrad requested a private meeting the following afternoon at his attorney's office. Nadine attended, along with one of Armitage's lawyers, but Conrad directed every word toward Noel and me. He looked thinner than he had in recent photographs. For the first time in my life, his suit seemed to be wearing him rather than the other way around. He placed a written summary on the table. $12 million would be transferred into a protected account for Noel and me. Her tuition and future graduate studies would be paid in full. She would receive a non-voting observer position on the restructured company's board. My name would be restored to the family trust and to the official history of the Armitage Foundation. 20 years earlier, Conrad had removed me before Noel and I left the hospital. Now he offered to put me back as if belonging were an entry he could restore in a database. "No," I said. He barely looked at me. "You have not considered what refusal may cost." "We considered the price before we came." The company may collapse before the court separates the conduct of its owners from the livelihoods of its employees. Credit lines are already tightening. Contractors are threatening to stop work. If Raven Rock's claim is challenged broadly rather than surgically, thousands of people may lose income while the litigation continues. He was using the same shield Vivian had used, but the threat was not imaginary. Innocent people could be harmed by delay. Conrad leaned toward Noelle. You can stop the liquidation without turning this into a public execution of your family. Noelle studied him with the same calm expression she used when examining damaged records. Do you remember my birthday? She asked. Conrad hesitated for less than a second. March 17th, 2006. What time? 3:12 in the morning. Noelle's fingers tightened around her pen. Which hospital? He named it, including the original wing that had been renovated when she was still a child. A pressure rose behind my ribs. He had walked away before the sun came up, yet he remembered every detail. I wanted to ask how many photographs he had purchased, how many school records his investigators had reviewed, and how often he had received reports about the granddaughter he refused to touch. I pushed my chair back. Noelle placed one hand over mine. Mom, do not argue with him. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped me. She turned to Conrad. Every offer you have made today must be put in writing, including the money, the board position, the family trust restoration, and the request that I limit my testimony. It must be preserved with the legal record. Conrad's attorney shifted in his seat. This was intended as a confidential settlement discussion. Then you should be comfortable documenting it accurately, Noelle replied. Conrad looked at her as if he had expected a frightened student and found someone whose patience made her harder to control. The meeting ended without an agreement. Nadine's strategy remained narrower than revenge and broader than the Armitage proposal. First, she would ask the court to suspend enforcement of Raven Rock's claim and stop the immediate asset sale. Once the company was no longer hours from being dismantled, she would request independent oversight, preservation of all relevant systems, and an investigation into insider transactions and management conduct. We save the employees first, she said. Then we prevent the people who created the fire from controlling the investigation into how it started. No single document could accomplish that. Miriam's photograph and Marion's letter established personal history, but did not prove financial fraud. Her archive codes led the examiner to the mainframe tape, but she had never possessed the tape herself. The 1,984 records revealed the Raven Rock prototype. The 2003 digitization report showed how Silas's title and archive classification were changed. Current server logs connected Raven Rock's documents to Armitage systems. The electronic key vault showed where signatures were approved. Banking records traced money. Emails revealed knowledge and intent. Witnesses explained how the systems were actually operated. Each source had its own origin, custody, and limitations. Together, they formed a structure strong enough to carry weight without depending on one miraculous discovery. The night before the hearing, we stopped working at 7. Elias made pancakes for dinner because they had been Noelle's comfort food since childhood, although calling his version comforting required generosity. One pancake folded over itself when he lifted it from the pan. Another had a center so pale that Noelle quietly moved it back toward the stove. No forensic analysis at the table, Elias said. I am trying to determine whether it is cooked. That sounds like analysis. For 20 minutes, we discussed nothing about Raven Rock, Silas, or court. Elias complained about the dishwasher. Noelle told us her professor had sent a message reminding her that testifying did not excuse an unfinished assignment. I listened to them and remembered that saving a company was not the same as saving a life. This table, these voices, and the ability to disagree without fear were the things I had already saved. Later, Noelle changed into the dark suit she planned to wear to court. I adjusted her collar, stepped back, then adjusted it again. If you touch it one more time, she said, that may qualify as tampering with evidence. I am your mother. I have jurisdiction. That is not how jurisdiction works. It has worked for 20 years. She smiled, but her eyes were tired. Nadine arrived with the final witness declaration. Noelle read every page before signing. The declaration described her role carefully. She had identified patterns, assisted the independent expert, and documented how she found specific discrepancies. It did not claim that she alone had authenticated the records or reached legal conclusions. After the list of materials already disclosed to Armitage and Raven Rock, Noelle added one new appendix code. It referred to a set of records connected to the encryption key vault controlled by Vivian's office. She did not explain its contents in the declaration. The supporting material had been verified, preserved, and provided to Nadine for use only if the foundation was properly established at the hearing. The next morning, the parties received the final evidence index before entering the courtroom. Conrad stood beside Vivian, while one of his lawyers handed him a copy. His eyes moved rapidly down the page until they reached the final appendix code. For the first time since Noelle began investigating Raven Rock, Conrad did not look at her. He turned toward Vivian. Conrad's glance toward Vivian lasted only a second, but it revealed more than any argument between them had. He recognized the appendix code, and whatever it contained frightened him because it pointed toward her. The bankruptcy courtroom was smaller than the Armitage boardroom I remembered from childhood. There were no company portraits, foundation awards, or polished displays of legacy. Conrad and Vivian sat behind their attorneys like two ordinary people whose claims had to survive evidence. Noelle took the witness stand after Nadine, and the independent examiner established how the disputed records had been located. Nadine handled the legal arguments. Noelle's role was limited to explaining what she had observed, how she documented it, and which findings had later been verified by independent specialists. She described receiving the cropped photograph from the silver box, comparing it with Miriam's complete photograph, and identifying the archive code written on the back. She explained that Miriam had not possessed secret corporate ledgers or the mainframe tape. Her personal papers had only led the examiner to the restricted storage section inside Armitage. The Raven Rock attorney rose for cross-examination. "You are 20 years old, correct?" "Yes." "You are still a student?" "Yes." "You have never served as a court-appointed examiner, bankruptcy trustee, or certified forensic expert?" "No." "And the people you accuse of wrongdoing are the grandparents from whom your mother has been estranged for 20 years. Noelle glanced at me before answering. "They are my grandparents. I have not offered an opinion on their legal guilt." The attorney suggested that she had interpreted ordinary migration errors as fraud because she wanted revenge for what happened at the hospital. He asked whether discovering that a man in an old photograph resembled her had influenced her conclusions. Nadine objected when the questions moved beyond Noelle's technical role. The judge allowed limited inquiry into possible bias, but repeatedly directed the attorney back to the verification process. Noelle did not claim to be neutral about our family. She said she had documented every step precisely because she knew her relationship to the Armitages could be used to challenge her. "I identified discrepancies," she said. Dr. Bell reproduced the results. The examiner controlled the evidence. I did not authenticate my own conclusions. The Raven Rock attorney then attacked the 1984 data tape. He argued that its age, damaged sectors, and association with Silas Rowan made it unreliable. For several tense minutes, it appeared that the earliest evidence might be excluded from meaningful consideration. The judge did not reject it entirely. She allowed only limited use until the examiner and Dr. Bell completed testimony about the archive code, storage seal, recovery location, and chain of custody. That restriction frustrated Nadine, but it was not the disaster Raven Rock's attorneys presented it as. The tape had not appeared from Miriam's private basement. It had been recovered from Armitage's own restricted archive under court supervision. Dr. Bell testified that he had photographed the container before opening it, calculated digital hashes for every recoverable image, and preserved the original tape without alteration. The examiner confirmed that the archive code matched the paper index Miriam had identified, and that the sealed container had remained in Armitage custody until the court authorized retrieval. The judge admitted the verified portions for the limited purpose of comparing system structures and historical project codes. She made clear that the tape alone would not prove the modern debt fraudulent. Raven Rock's attorneys seemed relieved. They presented signed loan agreements, notarized certifications, security documents, and board approvals. On paper, Raven Rock appeared to be an independent creditor that had advanced substantial funds to Armitage during a period of financial pressure. Conrad's attorney portrayed him as a founder trying to prevent thousands of layoffs. He described the proposed asset sale as painful but necessary, and warned that continued delay could destroy the remaining value of the company. I watched Conrad lower his head at the correct moments, as though the weight of 4,000 families rested on his shoulders rather than behind him as protection. Nadine called Noelle again to explain the digital pattern. Noelle compared an Armitage project file to a sealed envelope with a machine-generated stamp. Each internal project received a digital fingerprint assembled from 3 components: an entity code, a project sequence, and a verification value. An outside company could know a project name or contract number, she said. It should not be able to generate the internal 3-part fingerprint unless it had access to Armitage's system or copied data created there. She displayed the identifiers from the 1984 prototype, the 2003 mapping table, and the current Raven Rock contracts. Each contained the same 3-part formula. Each also carried the same reversed pair of numbers first recorded in the old mainframe system. The Raven Rock attorney called it coincidence. Dr. Bell testified that he had repeated Noelle's comparison independently. He found the same pattern, then searched unrelated Armitage projects to determine whether the formula was widely shared. It was not. The current contracts contained another problem. Their printed dates claimed they had been signed months before Armitage's financial crisis became public. The server history showed the electronic files had not existed at that time. They had been created later, then backdated. The new appendix established how the signatures and payments were divided. Approval certificates had been generated using an encryption key stored in the secure vault controlled by Vivian's office. Separate server logs showed Conrad's workstation approving the transfers that made Raven Rock appear to have advanced money before receiving secured claims against Armitage assets. Vivian's office approved the signatures. Conrad's system approved the money flow. Neither could be explained as an isolated employee using one stolen password. The actions occurred across separate protected systems and required authority from both offices. Vivian whispered sharply to her attorney. Conrad stared ahead, refusing to look at her again. Nadine asked the court for immediate temporary relief. She did not demand that Conrad and Vivian be declared criminals. She requested that Raven Rock's claim be suspended, the asset sale halted, all relevant servers preserved, and an independent Chapter 11 examiner given expanded authority to investigate the insider transactions. The judge recessed for nearly an hour. When she returned, she ruled that the overlap between Raven Rock and Armitage created serious questions about the creditor's independence and the authenticity of its claim. She temporarily suspended enforcement of Raven Rock's secured position and stopped the planned sale of the company's core assets. All relevant electronic systems, executive devices, financial records, and encryption logs were placed under preservation orders. The examiner received authority to investigate the related party transactions and report whether further management restrictions were necessary. Armitage would continue operating under temporary limitations. Payroll and essential projects could proceed with oversight. The company had not been awarded to Noelle, and no one had been found criminally liable. The immediate liquidation had been stopped. Thousands of jobs and retirement benefits were no longer hours away from being sacrificed to Raven Rock's claim. Conrad exhaled and closed his eyes. When he turned toward Noelle, relief softened his face, as though he had mistaken her decision to protect employees for a decision to protect him. As we passed his table, he leaned close enough for us to hear. "You did the right thing. The rest can be handled privately." Noelle stopped. "I have not finished my testimony. Conrad's relief disappeared. Nadine returned to the lectern and asked the court to consider evidence that the current financial crisis might have been deliberately manufactured by Armitage's own leadership. She also requested permission to explain why the earliest employee, who identified Raven Rock's structure, had been removed from the company's history. The judge looked from the 1,984 project codes to the 2003 digitization records, and then to the current debt schedules. If these materials come from 3 different periods, she asked, why do they use the same unusual structure? Noelle looked directly at Conrad and Vivian. Because this was not their first clean bankruptcy. Noelle's sentence changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. Until that moment, Raven Rock could still be described as a suspicious modern creditor with unusual access to Armitage systems. Her answer forced the court to consider something larger. The current bankruptcy might be the latest version of a structure created decades earlier. Nadine began with 1,984. She showed how Silas discovered the original Raven Rock prototype, objected to a plan that would move profitable assets into a related entity, and preserved internal audit notes through Armitage's authorized backup process. Soon afterward, bidding files appeared under his employee account, while field reports placed him at a construction site without access to the mainframe. The records did not prove every detail of the accusation had been fabricated, but they proved the company had ignored a serious timing conflict before using those files to destroy him. Next came 2003. During the digital conversion, the old Raven Rock codes were entered into the modern system. The dormant entity was registered again. Silas's title was changed from founding partner to terminated consultant, and his records were moved into restricted storage. Miriam testified about the process she had witnessed. She identified Vivian's written instruction changing Silas's title, then explained that Conrad had authorized the restriction placed on the archive. She did not claim her memory replaced technical proof. The examiner produced the migration report, system log, and access history recovered from Armitage's own storage. Miriam's testimony explained who had issued the instructions that the records independently documented. Nadine then connected those historical actions to the present Chapter 11 case. The modern Raven Rock claim used the same project code structure created in 1984 and migrated in 2003. Its contracts had been generated inside Armitage after the dates printed on them. Vivian's encryption vault approved the signatures, while Conrad's system approved the money transfers, used to make the loans appear genuine. 3 different periods were no longer 3 separate mysteries. They were one repeated method. Silas had discovered the first design. Conrad and Vivian had erased him, preserved the design, then used it when they believed the company could be stripped without exposing them. The adoption records and my original birth certificate were introduced next. Nadine made clear that being Silas Rowan's daughter did not give me ownership of Armitage, nor did it place Noelle in line to inherit the company. The records mattered because they explained why the Rowan estate had standing to request access to Silas's sealed file, and why Conrad and Vivian had spent 40 years concealing my identity. When Nadine called me, I walked to the witness stand with the strange awareness that the people who had controlled my childhood were now required to listen without interrupting. I testified about Noelle's birth. I repeated Conrad's question about the newborn screening card and explained that heel prick screening was used to identify certain medical conditions, not to determine paternity or family relationships. The hospital was never going to discover her ancestry from that test, I said. What mattered was that, within hours of her birth, an Armitage office tried to learn where her biological sample and records would be stored. Nadine showed the access log documenting the unauthorized request and the hospital's denial. She then presented invoices, proving that Vivian's office later hired investigators to monitor public references linking Noelle to the Rowan family. For 20 years, I said, they acted as though they had forgotten her. In reality, they were watching for the day she might learn who they had recognized in her. Vivian's attorney attempted to recast everything as protection. He asked whether Vivian had fed me, educated me, and cared for me after Marion and Silas died. I answered yes. Vivian leaned toward the microphone when she was later permitted to respond. She said she had saved an orphan child from instability and given me a privileged life. I looked directly at her. A person can give a child a roof and still take away her name, her history, and her right to know who she is. Vivian's face tightened, but Conrad spoke before her attorney could stop him. The original structure was hers, he said. Vivian wrote the Raven Rock proposal. I did not design it. The courtroom shifted toward her. Vivian turned on him immediately. You planted the files under Silas's credentials. You registered Raven Rock in 2003. You approved every transfer in this bankruptcy because you expected to buy the assets back. Their attorneys tried to silence them, but the alliance had already broken. Conrad accused Vivian of controlling the signature vault and editing the drive she gave us. Vivian accused Conrad of ordering Silas's archive locked, directing the modern transfers, and using the current bankruptcy to protect his ownership. Each accusation supplied a missing connection in the evidence already before the court. They were no longer defending a shared story. They were confirming separate parts of the same one. Noelle returned to the stand only after Nadine established the foundation for her final testimony. Raven Rock's attorney suggested that she wanted Armitage transferred to her family. Noelle rejected the premise. I am not asking the court to give me this company, she said. I am asking the court to protect it from people who used it as a shield against accountability. She turned toward Conrad and Vivian. For 20 years, I had imagined what I might say if they were ever forced to explain why they walked away from my daughter. Every sentence I had rehearsed sounded small compared with the calmness in Noelle's voice. You did not leave because of how I looked, she said. You left because you recognized the family you had erased. The room became so quiet that I could hear Vivian's bracelet strike the wooden table as her hand began to shake. Noelle continued. I saved the company because 4,000 families depend on it. I did not come here to save you. Vivian's face lost its color. She reached for the table, missed the edge, and collapsed back into her chair while her attorney called for assistance. The hearing did not become a criminal sentencing. The bankruptcy judge did not declare either of them guilty of fraud, perjury, or obstruction. The examiner reported substantial evidence of fraud, dishonesty, insider dealing, and gross mismanagement. Based on that report, the judge ordered the appointment of an independent Chapter 11 trustee. The order ended Conrad and Vivian's control over Armitage, while allowing the company to continue operating. The trustee received authority to preserve assets, secure electronic systems, oversee essential payments, and investigate the disputed transactions. Raven Rock's claim remained suspended. The planned asset sale remained stopped. Evidence suggesting fraud, false statements, and obstruction was referred to the U.S. trustee and the appropriate investigative authorities. Conrad protested that removing him would destroy the company. The judge replied that the company's survival could no longer depend on the people whose conduct had placed it in danger. Court security escorted Conrad and Vivian through the side aisle after the hearing. As Vivian passed my row, she turned toward me. My daughter. It was the first time she had called me that since Noelle was born. I did not turn around. That evening, Nadine arrived at our house with a sealed envelope. Vivian had sent it through her attorney and marked it for me alone. I held the letter in both hands, wondering whether one more explanation could give me anything the truth had not already provided. Vivian's letter remained sealed on our kitchen counter for 3 days. I moved it whenever I wiped the surface, but I never opened it. Each time my hand touched the envelope, I imagined the words inside. She might blame Conrad, explain that she had loved me imperfectly, or describe every sacrifice she believed entitled her to forgiveness. None of those possibilities changed what had already been proven. Elias never told me what to do with it. Noelle did not ask to read it. They understood that the decision was not about discovering another secret. It was about deciding whether Vivian still had the right to place her version of herself inside my mind. I put the envelope in a drawer. Over the following months, the bankruptcy moved at the slower pace of real consequences. The court-appointed trustee took control of Armitage's daily operations, while investigators reviewed the Raven Rock claim, insider transfers, encryption records, and backdated agreements. The company did not recover overnight. Contractors still demanded assurances, employees worried about payroll, and retirees attended every public hearing concerning their benefits. However, the core projects continued under supervision, and the asset sale Conrad and Vivian had planned never took place. After the examiner completed the first major review, Raven Rock's creditor claim was disallowed. The supposed loans had been created through Armitage's own systems, supported by fabricated obligations, and approved by offices controlled by the same insiders who expected Raven Rock to seize the company's valuable assets. Related transactions were canceled or subjected to recovery orders. Money and property that had been moved through connected entities were traced and, where the court permitted, returned to the bankruptcy estate. That ruling did not send Conrad or Vivian directly to prison. The investigations into financial fraud, false statements, and obstruction continued through the U.S. trustee and other authorities. Nadine reminded us that accountability did not become less real simply because it unfolded through audits, subpoenas, hearings, and separate proceedings instead of one dramatic sentence. Conrad and Vivian lost their executive positions, board seats, company privileges, and access to corporate funds for their personal defense. A portion of their private assets was frozen, while potential restitution and recovery claims were evaluated. They were no longer permitted to enter Armitage offices without authorization. For most of my life, I had imagined them as inseparable from the company. Their names were carved into buildings, printed on foundation programs, and repeated in speeches about legacy. Watching Armitage continue without them proved that they had never been the institution itself. They had only controlled it long enough to convince everyone that removing them would destroy it. The trustee presented a restructuring plan designed to protect the profitable operations without preserving the old concentration of power. The proposed board included independent directors, employee representation, and a separate oversight mechanism for retirement funds. Only after the creditors and court approved, the plan did management authority pass to the new board. The company did not become mine, Noelle's, or part of the Rowan estate. That was exactly as it should have been. Noelle had never entered the courtroom to inherit an empire. She had entered because 4,000 families should not lose their livelihoods to a debt the company's own leaders had manufactured. The restructured board later offered her an honorary observer position. The invitation praised her role in identifying the digital patterns that helped stop the liquidation. She read the letter twice, then declined. "I still have a degree to finish," she told me, "and I do not want what they did to become my shortcut to power." She said she might work in forensic accounting after graduation, but she wanted to earn every position without a family scandal opening the door. I was prouder of that refusal than I would have been if she had accepted a corner office. Armitage also corrected its official history. Silas Rowan's name returned to the company's founding records, not as a disgraced consultant, but as a structural engineer, co-founder, and the first person documented to have objected to Raven Rock's self-serving design. The public statement did not transform him into a flawless hero. It simply restored the truth that had been taken from him. A copy of the corrected history arrived at our house with his original company photograph. For the first time, no one had been cut from the frame. Miriam received a formal public apology for the pressure placed on records employees during the 2003 conversion. The restructuring plan protected the pension benefits she had feared losing, along with those of other retirees. She did not suddenly become another grandmother in our family. Neither of us needed to force intimacy onto a relationship built through painful evidence. She did, however, Begin attending the baking class I taught twice a month at the community center. Miriam measured every ingredient precisely and disliked recipes that used phrases such as a generous amount. Noelle told her that this was a reasonable position for a former records manager. By then, the letter from Vivian had remained unopened for 6 weeks. I took it from the drawer one evening and sat beside Elias on the porch. He glanced at the envelope, then waited. I used to believe that one perfect explanation could make everything hurt less, I said. Do you still believe that? No, I knew enough. I knew who my parents were, what they had done to Silas, why they had raised me, and what they had recognized in Noelle. Anything Vivian added would be an attempt to rename control as sacrifice and secrecy as love. The next morning, I gave the sealed letter to Nadine and asked her to return it. I did not include a response. For the first time, not knowing what Vivian wanted to say did not keep me awake. Boundaries no longer felt like unfinished conversations. They felt like doors I was finally allowed to close. I placed Silas's restored photograph in our hallway, beside the only photograph we had found of Marion. I did not build a memorial in the center of the living room or allow the past to take over the house. Their pictures stood among Noelle's school portraits, our wedding photograph, birthday snapshots, and one image of Elias losing an argument with a collapsed backyard lantern. Silas and Marion belonged in our history, but they did not replace the life we had built without them. On a Sunday morning, several months after the court approved the restructuring plan, I woke to the smell of something burning. Elias stood at the stove wearing an apron that claimed he was an excellent cook. The smoke detector had already expressed a different opinion. He carried a stack of dark-edged pancakes to the table and placed them in front of Noelle. "These legally qualify as breakfast," he announced. Noelle examined the top pancake with professional suspicion. A court would reject that claim for lack of evidence. I have witnesses. Mom is emotionally compromised. I poured coffee and sat between them while they continued arguing about whether syrup could rehabilitate damaged food. Sunlight crossed the family photographs in the hallway. It touched Marion's face, Silas's restored place in the company portrait, and Noelle, at 8 years old beside the family tree, where she had included the neighbor's dog because he always came when she called. Conrad and Vivian had spent decades believing that family was something they could control through names, money, silence, and access. They had raised me inside their house, but never trusted love to keep me there. When Noelle was born, they saw her face and realized the history they had buried had returned in a form they could not command. What they failed to understand was that Noelle's appearance was never the danger. The danger was the truth, and the truth did not destroy the company. It separated the company from the people who had been destroying it. I watched my husband and daughter laugh over pancakes. No reasonable person would have served to guests. There was no foundation bearing our name, no empire waiting to be inherited, and no powerful family asking us to return. There were only people who stayed. They had walked away because my daughter's face brought the past back. 20 years later, she saved everything worth saving and left the people who erased us with nothing but the truth.